What up, Mastodon? I'm Leon, the Paperback Maniac, coming at you with another vintage horror book review. Today, we are taking a look at Grimm Reapings by R. Patrick Gates. This book is the sequel to the 1990 cult horror classic Grimm Memorials, a book which I read and reviewed on the channel last year. This book was published by Pinnacle in 2006. And I had been eager to get to this thing ever since reading and loving Grimm Memorials this time last year. In fact, I think I uploaded my review of Grimm Memorials exactly a year from yesterday. And so I'm very happy to be making this my final vintage horror book review of 2019, the way that the former novel was the last review I did, last year. I will try to remember to go ahead and post a link to that review in case you missed it and are curious to check it out. Right now, I will read the synopsis from the back cover, which does a pretty thorough job of summarizing things. You can't go home again. Northwood, Massachusetts. It's been 13 years since siblings Jennifer and Jackie Naylor nearly lost their very souls to the enchantments of Eleanor Grimm. The Victorian mansion where Eleanor once conjured her wicked schemes now belongs to Jen and her husband. The couple is converting the former mortuary into a bed and breakfast and artist colony to create a nurturing environment for the baby they're expecting, and hopefully to purge the house of its evil. But although Eleanor's body has been laid to rest, her spirit still lingers in the mind of the youngest Naylor sibling, Steve. A mere infant when Eleanor was thwarted in her attempt to possess his body, Steve has now come of age, ripe for plucking and easily manipulated. With Eleanor guiding his every move, Steve is compelled to help her gather victims and perform the rituals that will place her soul into Jennifer's unborn child. Only Jackie, tormented for years by nightmares of the horrors Eleanor inflicted upon him, is aware of his brother's possession. And only he knows what must be sacrificed if anyone in his family is to survive. All right, so the novel opens 13 years after the events of Grimm Memorials. Jackie Naylor, the child protagonist of the former book, is now a 19-year-old college student. He's kind of rocking a punk look. He's got some green-tinted, choppy bangs. He has a goth girlfriend named Chalice, a girl who most likely worked at Hot Topic when she was in high school and probably owns at least 2 Tiffany dolls. And Jackie, of course, is still haunted by the horrific events that occurred 13 years ago, the gruesome mass murders that occurred on Halloween night at the funeral home known as Grimm Memorials and at the hands of the wicked witch Eleanor Grimm. Now, at the start of the novel, Jackie is being uncomfortably pressured by his girlfriend Chalice, who has gathered all her goth friends to the common room of the dorm that they live in, to watch a new TV special that is airing about the Grimm Memorials Halloween Massacre. And a TV special, incidentally, that Jackie and his older sister Jennifer were recently interviewed for. So, or maybe it was only Jackie that was interviewed for it. Basically, so at the start of the book, there is this TV special that airs that kind of goes over this horrible event that happened 13 years ago. It's kind of a nifty way for Gates to catch the reader up on what occurred in the last book, kind of catch everyone up to speed. Jackie Naylor, the college student, and his older sister Jennifer, who's now 23, they have a young sibling named Steve Jr. Steve was actually unborn at the time of these horrible events. In fact, he was born the day after November 1st, 13 years ago, right after Jackie and his sister Jennifer and their mother had escaped, from Eleanor Grimm. But Jackie has been kept completely ignorant of the events that occurred, 13 years ago and surrounding his birth. His mother has been like way overprotective, never mentioned any of this to him. She's homeschooled him for the last 13 years and tried to kind of just, insulate him, against this, and so that he would not know about his past or, the weird, terrible circumstances of his birth. Now, of course, Steve is very curious about his past and wants to know, like what happened 13 years ago, what happened to his father who died, right before he was born, and so on. And so on the night of this TV special, which is, on the anniversary of the Grimm Memorials Halloween Massacre, little Steve sneaks out of house and goes and meets up with a friend so that he can watch the news special and kind of like learn a little bit about this, forbidden family history. And then the news program basically goes on to tell us, the reader, as well, about Eleanor Grimm, who was the worst female serial killer and child murderer in the history of the United States. A woman who had lured countless children to her funeral home estate called Grimm Memorials, deep in the woods, and, quote, performed unspeakable acts of depravity and murder in a series of bizarre rituals whose purpose authorities are still debating. Some have come to believe they were designed to somehow prolong Eleanor Grimm's life, perhaps even grant her immortality, end quote. And then the news program tells us a little bit about the victims of Eleanor Grimm, namely the 13 prepubescent boys, also Steve Naylor's mother, Diane Naylor, who was pregnant with little Steve at the time. And all of these people abducted in order to take part in these gory occult rituals. The news program talks about how Eleanor sacrificed these children to the dark pagan gods she worships in rituals involving, quote, butchery and cannibalism, end quote. So yes, she did eat those kids. And the newscast also mentions Stephen Sr., little Steve's father, who was believed to have helped Eleanor Grimm abduct his own wife and a bunch of kids before, being killed by Eleanor himself. So, obviously, finding out all this stuff from the news show, little Steve, 13-year-old Steve, is shocked, right? I mean, he had no idea that his father, who's been dead his whole life, was complicit in all of these child murders. And it's just a shock that all of this happened, like, when, he was in utero right before he was about to be born. Also, the news program talks a little bit about Steve's siblings, Jennifer and Jackie Naylor, or who are kind of like the proverbial Hansel and Gretel of the story. They were Eleanor's final kidnapped victims, and they basically, like a modern day Hansel and Gretel, they turned things around, killed the witch by shoving her in her own crematorium oven. So, and then during the special, Jackie Naylor is interviewed by Barbara Waters, not Barbara Walters, but Barbara Waters. I'm not sure why Gates did that. And is asked, how does he know that this Eleanor Grimm was in fact a witch? Because of course, right after the event, he said that she was a witch. No one believed him, of course, until they found all of her, her strange books on occult practices and, black magic rituals, things, dating back to the Druids. But, Jackie says that, Eleanor Grimm could do things with her mind. She had this sort of hypnotic or psychic power. She could make you see things that weren't really there. She could also force you to do her bidding, and make you lose control of your own actions and things. And that's a big part of these books, of her being able to do that. So, and then this news program concludes by mentioning the ironic fact that Jennifer Naylor, Jackie's older sister, and who is completely has no memory of anything that occurred 13 years ago, She actually currently owns the land and the estate of this Grimm Memorials funeral home and has moved in with her husband and is now converting the place into a bed and breakfast called the Magic Forest Bed and Breakfast, which is due to be opened in a year from now, next Halloween actually, which is perfect, right at the anniversary of all these child murders. Yeah, that's pretty strange, right? And also, apparently interesting is the fact that Eleanor Grimm had left her entire estate and all of her money to little Steve Naylor, the unborn child of Diane Naylor, one of the women that she abducted when she was very pregnant at the time. That's really strange, right? And then, so ever since they killed the witch 13 years ago, of course, because of this, Jackie Naylor, the older sibling, can never shake the fact and wonder if maybe, even though they killed Eleanor Grimm, was she able to really still sneak her soul into the unborn baby, which was born literally the next day? Is there a trace of her still in there? And it took him like years of therapy to sort of like accept the fact that Eleanor Grimm is dead, although he can never like shake the idea that she did definitely have these supernatural powers, and she could inexplicably control people and do things, unnatural things, with her mind. So suffice it to say that after watching this news program, little Stephen Naylor is in shock, finding out all these terrible things, finding out that he's now rich because this serial killer / witch left him everything in her will because she thought that she'd be able to transfer her soul into his unborn body. The fact that she made his father possibly commit all these heinous crimes, it's a lot for a 13-year-old to take. So it isn't long before little Steve, this 13-year-old kid, is having strange dreams of being burned alive and having his first wet dream while he's riding his stuffed SpongeBob SquarePants doll in bed until he gets his first, let's say, emission. That something is awakening in him. He feels something awakening, and of course, what would that be? Eleanor Grimm, right? She's back. So after the TV program airs, Jackie Naylor, the college guy, who's the little Steven's older brother, is now like the most popular dude on campus, and he finds it a little strange that he's suddenly so popular for this terrible thing that happened. He becomes a minor celebrity. All the girls want to bang him, but he's got eyes only for his beautiful goth girlfriend Chalice. And in fact, when Thanksgiving break comes around, he invites his girlfriend to come back home with him, and she accepts. And rather than go back and stay with the mom, they think, Jackie thinks that would be awkward bringing his girlfriend there. He decides instead to go and stay with his sister Jen at the newly renovated Grimm Memorials funeral home, right? Yeah, that makes sense. The site of all of these, child tortures and murders, the place where, his stepfather was killed and where he and his sister had endured the most horrific moment of their life, probably. He decides he'll go there, and his sister is thrilled. She says, yes, I'll make up, I'll give you guys the best room to stay. She's really happy that he's coming home for the holidays. And, of course, there are omens and portents right from the start when Jackie and his girlfriend Chalice start heading back home to Northwood, Massachusetts, with a little sleepy town which sits nestled under the shadow of Mount Sugarloaf. And they're driving under these, ominous, roiling thunderhead clouds that unleash a bunch of rain, and they pass this creepy lightning blasted tree with a raven sitting on top, watching them eerily like a sentry. And meanwhile, Eleanor Grimm's newly awakened consciousness slowly starts testing its limits within little, 13-year-old Steve Naylor. She's trying to use her dormant psychic powers, which she calls the machine, so that she can, take this guy over. So she begins, she first starts by sending Steve an image while he's masturbating of the time she was gang raped by 3 of her brother's college roommates. And this, helps little Steve finish, oddly. And she does this so that she can, at least share in his climax. But then she is sorely disappointed when the climax is not only pitiful, but is just one climax. And she thinks to herself, what? Only one? Is that what it's like being a man? And then she thinks, like, why did I take so much effort transferring my soul into this body if I can only have, like, weak climaxes like that, right? So she decides either way that she needs to find a way to take full control of this kid. She refuses to, quote, exist as a floating thought, never to have life or physical sensation, except through sharing the pitiful experiences of a host. End quote. So she starts to exert sort of subtle influences over this teenage kid. And before you know it, Jackie starts to have temper tantrums. He starts exploding at his mom for calling him little Steve. He starts acting uncharacteristically irascible. He also starts feeling these sudden, inexplicable urges to act violently. He starts having dreams of torturing a naked child tied to a chair with deadly medical instruments. And then, the child's eventual death kind of coinciding with his orgasms. And, to talk about wet dreams, this definitely is not your average puberty that he's going through, right? And Eleanor, the witch, inside him realizes that the more dream images that she sends to the boy, and which invariably, culminate in his nocturnal emissions, the more of that happens, the stronger her psychic power becomes. So she's like building up the machine or her psychic energy this way. However, this little kid, Steve, is pretty smart, and he realizes that if he jerks off before going to bed, he won't have those horrific dreams. Although every orgasm that he does have makes his defenses a little weaker and makes Eleanor a little stronger, gives her more power. And soon, she starts to be able to sort of see things through his eyes for brief interludes, and she starts to experience his thoughts, and so her power is slowly kind of developing. And she kind of takes heart from this. And, she believes that her psychic powers or quote unquote, the machine, it will only grow stronger. And eventually she'll be able to take full control of her host, little Steve. And then when Eleanor Grimm realizes that Steve's older brother, Jackie, the boy who thwarted her plans 13 years ago when she was, trying to do this, is going to be staying at the old house for the holidays, she is thrilled, and she resolves to not only take back possession of a body, but also to have her revenge against Jackie and his sister Jennifer, right? Hansel and Gretel from the last one. So the problem, though, is that Eleanor Grimm realizes that she's much weaker than before, and has new vulnerabilities that she never had, such as human touch to her hosts. If her hosts have human touch, it kind of like shuts her out, and she can't control them or sense things anymore. And so she realizes that the only way for her to sort of regain the full powers she has lost is to have more sacrifices, right? And that means more kids. More kids get to die, right? So soon, Eleanor Grimm is controlling not only 13-year-old Steve Naylor to do her evil and lustrous bidding, but also Steve's teenage sister-in-law, who is also staying at the bed and breakfast and is, according to Eleanor, easily corruptible, and someone who can, she can easily influence to do evil things as well. So, as Eleanor's power, sort of gains and she starts having more control over Steve, he starts to experience, weird things. I mean, this isn't, like I said, this isn't your average puberty. He starts to have blackouts. He has night visions of watching his own body, seemingly not of his volition, walk through the neighborhood and go and peer through windows of strangers' houses. He finds himself in the shower, covered in blood, just watching, tendrils of this red stuff, drain, go down the drain, and pulling some pulpy matter out of his teeth as if he'd been chewing on something fleshy. Very strange things. Then, over Christmas break, when the family is all back together again, Jennifer Naylor, the one who bought the Grimm Memorials estate and is living there and turned it into a bed and breakfast, she announces to Jackie very excitedly that she's pregnant. And Jackie finds this odd because she had never, wanted to have kids in the past, and now suddenly, after moving in to the Grimm Memorials estate, she's pregnant and happy about it. Interestingly, when little 13-year-old Steve Naylor finds out about the pregnancy, he also is very excited and offers to come and help over the winter break. Come to the bed, help set up the bed and breakfast. And Jennifer, is thrilled to hear this and actually invites her young half-brother Steve and the mother to come move in with them and says, yeah, why don't you guys just move in for a little while? We can make this Magic Forest bed and breakfast a true family business, and you guys can help out. And the mother is kind of influenced by this, and she even, looks into enrolling Steve in the local public middle school. And of course, when Steve and the witch Eleanor Grimm find out about this, they're at first furious and don't want that because they don't want to be away from Grimm Memorials. But then they soon think, well, what better place to gather the necessary sacrifices than at a school, right? Because to quote Eleanor Grimm, I need more virgin meat to gain strength to cast the boy out for good. Then sweet vengeance. End quote. So there you go. Pretty straightforward story. And look, I have always been a fan of a good teenage possession story, right? I'm thinking of movies like Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, or Amityville, The Possession. And that is essentially what we have here. Although, done in Gates is, typically, purposefully cheesy and energetic style. Now, this time around, we don't have visions of fairy tale creatures, which Eleanor Grimm sort of, manifests. We don't have fairy tale creatures coaxing young children to their grisly demises. And probably for good reason. I mean, I don't know how many kids these days, or even in the early 2000s when this was written, even know who, like, Little Bo Peep or Humpty Dumpty or Mother Goose is, honestly. But we do have pop culture references. So, for instance, one kid gets cajoled into opening up his bedroom window when he thinks he sees a Power Ranger outside his bedroom at night. And then another girl sees Barney the purple dinosaur in the woods outside and gets, coaxed into going out there. Like the first novel, this one has a great New England setting. New England in the fall, because it begins at Thanksgiving break and then goes through Christmas, New Year's, and so on. So it's actually even a kind of a holiday novel. And, I can't say how many, Thanksgiving horror novels there are, or even, good holiday horror novels. And this is one, and that's awesome. So, you can put this next to Blood Rage and others as a good, Turkey Day or holiday horror novel. And I don't know, what is it about horror set around the holidays that we all love so much? I guess it's that juxtaposition of, pleasant, warm and tingly feelings with, grimness, no pun intended, or dread. But, it's just great. And it's really, so I was really happy actually to be reading this in December and having it kind of have that holiday horror feel. It's also got some fun dialogue, a very 80s feeling. For instance, Jackie's girlfriend uses such anachronistic epithets as calling him dork, retard, or my favorite, male chauvinist pig. Very old school. Put a smile on my face. The only character that really got on my nerves actually was Chalice, Jackie's goth girlfriend. She speaks in this really annoying, non-standard, almost like American dialect that was just did not like go with what I imagined her to speak like, and it was kind of like a disconnect and kind of off-putting, honestly. But there are some nice character touches, like the fact that Steve Naylor, because he grew up without a father, his father was killed by the witch right before he was born. And because, he lacked a male role model and it was always coddled by his overprotective mother, he adopted many feminine traits and is thus perceived as being quote unquote gay by the other kids in school. And, it's funny that also because he now is being taken over by a woman, it's like he ends up losing any masculinity he ever had in the first place. Let's see, what else do I have here? So, since the book takes place in the early 2000s, we get a lot of cool, almost retro at this point, references to things from that period. Like I mentioned, SpongeBob SquarePants earlier, Powerpuff Girls, TV shows like Fear Factor and Punk'd, Britney Spears, Linkin Park, My Chemical Romance, so on. So, that's pretty fun. I really like the idea of Eleanor Grimm's sort of a disembodied consciousness just trapped inside the body of a hormonal teenager and kind of sharing in his experiences, both physical and emotional, and, having fun with that. It is a fun teenage possession story. It takes the topic of puberty and its attendant physical and emotional, things and just like totally amps it up to sort of obscene levels. However, it must be said that this book is not nearly as violent or gory as Grimm Memorials. Sure, we do occasionally get things like a girl's face being eaten and then her being gobbled alive, but it's just not done kind of like with that same gleefully assiduous attention to detail as some of Gates's earlier novels. However, what we do get in lieu of the constant child murder and violence is a lot of over the top sex scenes, which I have to admit are not always executed the best. Lots of onanism in this book, lots of adolescent masturbation and adolescent sex. Here, Gates really seems to be exploring the sexual side of horror and how horror can conflate with sex, and and how horror and sex, life and death, are really just two sides to the same coin, right? And it must be said that in both the first book, Grimm Memorials, and this one, there is, in both of them, one standout scene of sexual perversity in which a character, under the spell of Eleanor Witch, thinks he or she is having sex with an incredibly attractive person, but is in reality having sex with someone not that, and someone who they certainly would not want to be having sex with. And, those scenes will either offend the living shit out of you, or they will make you chuckle and kind of smile to yourself. And so you can guess, how I reacted when I read those scenes. In Grimm Memorials, it was a scene in a bar. In this one, it's a scene in a barn. And it's just, these scenes, they're so luridly gross and just like tastelessly taboo that you can't help but just love it and just be in awe of, where Gates is willing to take it. Also, as in his other novels, when the violence does happen, it's amped up and exaggerated to the point where it becomes almost cartoonish. Not to be taken seriously. Some people may not like that. I, of course, love it. I mean, like when a kid crashes his bike on the bottom of a steep hill and his basically face becomes smeared on the blacktop, and then landing next to this bloody skid mark is a single eyeball that still has some bloody tissue attached to it. I mean, that's like a fucking Roadrunners cartoon, right? It's just great. I love it. And then when the teenager, who has caused this bike accident, by the way, to happen, then walks up to the bloody smear on the pavement, and what does he do? Scoops up the quote-unquote wad of hamburger that used to be the kid's face and starts eating it. It's just that's just perfectly melted golden cheese right there, right? Just amazing cheese. Yeah, and being an OG, R. Patrick Gates Can't help but add a little incest into the mix, even if it is unwitting incest on the part of the characters. But it's more of like a sick joke on, Eleanor Grimm's part. Still very disgusting. And as far as the writing, the prose is workmanlike. It's fine. Gates does have a tendency to overuse italics, though, and exclamation points, which was kind of interesting. Obviously, with any novel like this, but especially this one, you have to suspend your disbelief quite a bit. For instance, why would Jennifer Naylor buy and move into the house of all these atrocities, even if she doesn't remember it herself, and think that she's going to convert it into a bed and breakfast, and people knowing the history of all these kids who were lured there, mutilated, and eaten by this crazy woman, why they would want to stay at a bed and breakfast there. But you can't overthink it. Otherwise, there would be no story here. And it does kind of get explained away at the end a little bit. Although, of course, it is still quite ridiculous. You don't actually have to read Grimm Memorials to read this one. Gates does such an exhaustive job in the beginning, kind of going over the characters and the incidents that occurred in the last one. The first third of this book is probably just recapping all that, like with the news program and little Steve Naylor, like trying to find out what happened, what his history is with his father and stuff. So you could actually probably read this, although you'd be doing a great disservice to yourself if you just went right to this one without having read Grimm Memorials, because I really do think Grimm Memorials is an excellent fantasy horror novel, and frankly one of my favorite vintage horror books of this time. Like fantasy horror, supernatural horror books. If I had one complaint about this book, though, it would be that it does take a little while to get going. It doesn't quite have that initial, fast pace of Grimm Memorials, because, he does have to kind of set it up and remind us. And then, even though it's been a year since I read Grimm Memorials, it was nice to get a little recap of what had happened through, the news special. But it does take a little while. And so it's not like as initially propulsive as his other books. But, the climax at the old Grimm Memorials funeral home, there we finally get back to, the Gates stuff that I love him for, namely the phantasmagoria, the weird dream imagery, the gross spectacle and gory set pieces. It's great. The horror, as I mentioned before, is always kept purposefully cheesy, however, and so never really scary. Although it's just always entertaining. If you're looking for entertainment value, that's why you read these books. And reading this book again, like I did before, got me to thinking that witches are just an awesome horror villain that is just, for some reason, I feel like really underutilized in the horror genre. Every year we get countless vampire and zombie books and movies, and I have to admit, it takes a lot for me to get excited about a vampire or a zombie story. Unless it's like done with a fresh take and in a new way, like say like the Orpheus Process or Deadweight by Robert Devereaux when it comes to zombies. But witches, why are they not used as much? I think they're super fun. They're super awesome. So I'm just gonna throw it out there for any authors out there who may be watching. Enough with the fucking zombies and witches, or zombies and vampires. Let's get some fucking witches, man. The witches are cool. Witches and aliens too, I think, are not as utilized as they should be. But yeah, this book, if you haven't gathered already, highly recommended. I had a blast with it. Is this a mainstream horror novel? Is this going to appeal to mainstream audiences? No, of course not. But then again, very few of the books I review on this channel are that. Gates has said with Grimm Memorials, the first one, he wanted to write the ultimate child in peril novel, and he certainly succeeded. And I think he has a very worthy successor with this one. And this one, I would also characterize as a great child in peril, or like maybe adolescent in lust as well, novel. it's for a certain type of reader. This isn't for everyone, but if for those kindred spirits, for those people who love books like Lee, what's his name? Lee Clark. Lee Clark's The Feeding. If you like that, if you like movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, or even Pet Sematary 2, then you're in for a treat here. If you were like me and read Grimm Memorials but haven't gotten around to this one yet, I highly encourage you to do that and to do it now. I think, this is a great, it's a great winter book. It's a great book to be read around the holiday season, December, even January, February. Now, if you haven't read any Gates, here's what I recommend you do. I recommend you start with Fear. And if I'm being honest, that one is probably still my favorite. I just love how just crazy and just gory and gooey and icky and 80s that one is. But start with Fear, then read Grimm Memorials, which is probably his most famous book, and then from there go to this one. And I will say that Fear and Grimm Memorials are both amazing fall books, great books to read in like October, November. And this one, Grimm Reapings, is a great winter book. So, perfect December read, perfect read for this time of the year. It is apparently, it's said that Gates is working on a third book in the series, Grimm Beginnings, in which he kind of goes over Eleanor Grimm's origin story. And I am super pumped for that. Very excited. Can't wait for him to finish and release that one. So yes, that is Grimm Reapings, guys. Highly recommend it. Read Grimm Memorials first. Better yet, read Fear first, then Grimm Memorials, then read this one. Eleanor Grimm is such a fantastic literary horror villain. And, she's up there with Freddy Krueger, in my opinion. So definitely worth checking out if you're into that kind of extreme, over-the-top, cheesy, gory horror. So, yeah, that will do it. That's my last book review of 2019, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, thank you so much, for watching. Always very appreciative of that. If you've read this book or if you're a fan of Gates, definitely drop a line below. I love talking about Gates. It goes without saying, there's no one in my real life that reads R. Patrick Gates that I can talk about him with. So, check back very soon in the next few days. I hope to do a top 10 favorite vintage horror reads of 2019. So that should be pretty fun. And then, just look out for more fun vintage horror book reviews in 2020. And I will see you guys later. Peace out.